I didn't wake up to an alarm that morning. I woke up to the sound of metal tearing through my family history. That low diesel roar that makes the window glass buzz and the air taste like hot steel. And at first, half asleep, I told myself it had to be road work down by the highway, some crew chewing up asphalt far from Willow Bend Drive. But when the floorboards under my bare feet started to tremble in a way this house had never trembled before, I knew those machines were not somewhere out there. They were right outside my elderly mother's bedroom, crawling toward the only home she had ever really called hers. By the time I dragged on my boots and sprinted down the front steps, the small house that had anchored 3 generations of my family was already shuddering under the blade of a bulldozer, siding cracking like bones, glass exploding outward in glittering arcs, dust rolling across the yard like smoke from a slow, deliberate fire. And in the middle of that storm stood my mother, Margaret Hale, in her nightgown, barefoot in the wet grass, clutching a shoebox of old photographs so tight her knuckles were white, staring at 60 years of birthdays and Christmases and bad days and better days being chewed into rubble right in front of her, too stunned even to scream. At the curb, arms folded like a queen watching a siege, stood Caroline Pierce, president of the Lakeview Meadows HOA, red blazer sharp as a hazard light, clipboard tucked against her ribs like both shield and sword, barking into a walkie-talkie. "Keep going, gentlemen. We're behind schedule. This lot has to be cleared for expanded parking." Saying it with the casual calm of someone talking about trimming hedges instead of erasing a life. Absolutely convinced that what she was doing was not cruelty but community improvement, and completely unaware that less than 24 hours later she would walk into a courtroom, look up at the bench, and realize the man holding the gavel was the same neighbor she'd dismissed in the dust, because the son of the woman she had just displaced was not just some angry homeowner. He was Judge Daniel Hale of Redwood County, and the bulldozers had rolled straight into his jurisdiction. To understand why that mattered, you have to see what this street used to be, because Willow Bend Drive didn't start as a battlefield. It used to be the kind of place where mailboxes leaned toward each other like old men trading gossip, where kids drew crooked suns and stars in chalk on the pavement, where porch lights glowed warm over chipped steps and mismatched chairs, where my mother's modest house sat on a slight rise that caught the evening light just right, gold spilling across her geraniums and glinting off the brass numbers she polished every Saturday like a small, private ritual, a place with peeling paint and singing gutters, but a quiet dignity you couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. And into that ordinary piece marched the Lakeview Meadows Homeowners Association, which on paper existed to keep things tidy and safe, to manage hedge heights and pool passes and quiet hours, but in practice turned into a little kingdom for people who needed clipboards to feel tall, ruled by Caroline, backed by Greg Nolan, the treasurer who trusted spreadsheets more than neighbors, by Brenda Shaw, head of the Architectural Review Committee, who carried a ruler like a scepter, and by Lori Kemp, the email warrior who could pack a fine, a threat, and a fake smile into 3 paragraphs and sign it "warmest regards." And together they fell in love with a glossy brochure called Horizon 2040, reimagining Lakeview Meadows, full of stock photos and promises, and one neat map where 12 gray rectangles of expanded clubhouse parking sat, 3 of them stamped exactly where 3 old houses stood, one of those rectangles drawn right over my mother's address like a chalk outline someone was impatient to fill. At first, the pressure wore a polite mask, letters about exciting opportunities for community enhancement, surveys asking how enthusiastic residents were about more space for events, footnotes about possible lot adjustments, even a free Lakeview Meadows pen in the envelope, as if a little branded plastic could coax people into surrendering the front doors of their lives. And my mother just shook her head, slid the papers under a stack of church bulletins, and said, "They'll find some new gazebo to fuss over by fall," with that old nurse's grit in her voice. But people who get high on control don't stay gentle for long. And soon the envelopes turned into violation notices stamped with the HOA's crimson logo, each one ending with the same line: "Fines assessed to your account. Compliance required within 10 days. As if a 90-year-old woman could repaint shutters, replace a mailbox, and replant her flowers on their schedule or be buried under fees. They wrote her up for unapproved mailbox color variation, because the once black box they had required had simply faded to charcoal, For shutter misalignment 0.5 inches, which Brenda proudly measured with her ruler like she was documenting a crime scene. For non-compliant decorative statuary, aimed at a little fishing gnome my father bought years before he died, suddenly recast as a threat to neighborhood aesthetics, and every new letter made my mother's hands tremble a little more as she opened it at the kitchen table, until I found myself standing at a Wednesday night board meeting in the clubhouse, the air thick with the smell of dry erase markers and burned coffee, telling them as calmly as I could. My mother, Margaret, is 90. She waters her roses every morning. She remembers every birthday on this street. Maybe we talk about reasonable timelines instead of burying her in fines. And watching Caroline smile at me like a cat at a bird feeder while she said, "Compliance is what keeps a community's gears turning, Mr. Hale," tapping her pen as Greg muttered about liability exposure, and Brenda waved her ruler like a badge of office. The certified letter that changed everything arrived thicker than the rest, dressed up in legal-sounding phrases like community reallocation and condemned under HOA authority. And when my mother read the last line, demolition scheduled, pending approval, her voice broke on the word demolition, as if her throat understood before her mind did, and I drove straight to City Hall, straight to the planning office, pulled every permit tied to Lakeview Meadows, and found a demolition order, bearing the name of a city inspector who had retired years earlier, a contract handed directly to Pierce and Sons Contracting, Caroline's husband's firm, approvals that had never seen a public agenda, HOA development, money flowing neatly into that company and out again into consulting fees. And when I got that inspector on the phone and heard him say, "Judge, I haven't signed anything for that subdivision in 6 years," I stopped being just a worried son and became exactly what they never expected to face, Judge Daniel Hale with a stack of their forged paperwork in his hands. The next morning, engines growled up Willow Bend Drive, bulldozers and a backhoe and a dump truck and a white pickup with the Lakeview Meadows HOA logo crawled toward my mother's house like an invading army. She stood in the yard with her Bible and rosary, slippers sinking into the damp grass, whispering, "Please don't," while I waved my arms at the lead machine and shouted that they had no lawful authority. But the operator just pointed at Caroline, who lifted a sheet of paper, repeated, "We have permits, history doesn't pay dues, parking lots do," and gave the order to proceed. And then the blade came down. The roses went under, the porch screamed and buckled, the living room wall split open like a wound, and I had to drag my mother back while she sobbed about photo albums and her kitchen table and sprint into a house that was already shaking itself apart to rescue what pieces of our life I could carry, knowing that by noon the building would be gone and a crude wooden sign would be stuck in the dirt announcing future clubhouse parking, courtesy of Lakeview Meadows HOA. My mother would be sitting on a borrowed folding chair clutching one rescued album like a life raft and asking, "Where do I sleep now?" And I would tell her, "With me, safe." And tomorrow we stopped letting them write the story, leaving out the part where the courtroom we were headed to was one I knew better than anyone. That night I sat in my home office, spread their permits and bank records and emails across my desk, pulled the statutes and cases I needed, and drafted an emergency injunction and a complaint that laid out, line by line, how Caroline, Greg, Brenda, Lori, and the Lakeview Meadows HOA had stepped so far outside their authority they were standing in open fraud. Then I filed it using powers I rarely invoke, not as a private lawyer. Ut as Judge Daniel Hale acting to protect a vulnerable resident from an abusive process so blatant it practically highlighted itself. And at 8:55 the next morning they walked into Redwood County Courthouse, Courtroom 3B, dressed in their best version of importance, Caroline in navy, Greg clinging to a bulging briefcase, Brenda with that same ruler in her tote, Lori already half composing a community update in her head, expecting some small-town judge they could steamroll with. Talk of bylaws, until I stepped through the side door in a black robe, took my seat at the bench, called the case Lakeview Meadows Homeowners Association versus Margaret Hale, and watched realization drain the color from their faces as they finally understood whose courtroom their bulldozers had driven them into. From the bench, they didn't look like rulers of anything. They looked like people who had finally run into a wall they couldn't talk their way through, shoulders tight, hands restless, eyes flicking toward the packed gallery where their own neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder. People who had been too scared to speak at HOA meetings now leaning forward with a kind of hungry hope, and I laid out the allegations in a voice that stayed calm even while my chest pounded. Unauthorized demolition, forged permits, financial misconduct, abuse of fiduciary duty, each phrase landing like another crack in the image they'd built of themselves as guardians of community standards. While the evidence went up on the screen, the forged signature of a retired inspector, HOA development funds flowing into Pierce and Sons, and then into board members' pockets, the email where Caroline typed, "If the Hales won't move, we'll clear them out," underlined by Brenda with the note, "Finally, progress." And even Lori, who had spent years weaponizing her keyboard, finally whispered, "I didn't think it would go this far," more to herself than to me. But complicity doesn't turn into innocence just because you didn't sit in the bulldozer's seat. I let the people they'd pushed around for years speak. Mrs. Ellison talking about fines on her wheelchair ramp. A young father describing how they forced him to tear down his kid's swing set in the name of consistency. The demolition foreman admitting he'd been told to claim safety hazard if anyone asked, and that watching my mother cry on her lawn made him know something was very wrong. And with every story, the board seemed to shrink another inch, rulers and clipboards suddenly looking like props from a bad play, not instruments of authority. In the end, I did what the law and my conscience demanded. I found the Lakeview Meadows HOA liable on every count before me, ordered substantial restitution into a fund for the residents they had harmed, dissolved the sitting board, and barred Pierce and Sons contracting from touching another community project for a decade, referred Caroline and Greg for criminal prosecution on fraud and conspiracy charges, placed Brenda and Lori under supervised sanctions and mandatory community service, and when Caroline tried one last time to say, "You can't do this, I am the HOA," I brought the gavel down hard enough to sting my palm and told her, "No, Ms. Pierce, you are not the rules, you are subject to them, just like everyone else." And the applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for the idea that power had finally been snatched back to where it belonged. In the months that followed, the lot where my mother's house had stood turned into a construction site again. But the sound was different this time. Not the cold grind of rented machines, but the rhythm of hammers and laughter and kids running around with paint on their hands. Neighbors who had barely nodded at each other before now working side by side. Veterans groups hauling lumber. The city finally stepping up with grants and expedited permits. And slowly, board by board, a new house rose. Where the future parking sign had once leaned, not an exact copy of the old place, but something stronger, with a rebuilt porch swing, a new birdbath etched by the neighbors with the words, "Justice lives here," and the same brass numbers my mother had polished for decades now shining on a fresh front door. On the day we moved her in, Willow Bend Drive turned into a block party. Someone grilled, someone played guitar, kids drew chalk hearts all over the new driveway. My mother cut a simple ribbon and walked inside with tears in her eyes and a small, fierce smile on her face. And that night we sat together on the new porch swing watching the sunset, and she said, "They thought they buried me, but all they did was plant me." And I realized she was right, because in trying to crush one old woman, under the weight of their bylaws, the Lakeview Meadows HOA had accidentally grown something they never intended, a neighborhood that finally knew how to stand up for itself. So here's where I leave you, with my mother back under her own roof, with the people who abused their tiny slice of authority facing real consequences, with roses growing again where painted lines were supposed to go, and with a question you can't dodge with a shrug when you see people around you hiding behind rules to hurt someone, when you hear policy used as a club instead of a guide. Are you going to stand on the metaphorical lawn and hope someone else steps in, or are you going to be the one who, even with shaking hands and a tight throat, says, "Enough," because bulldozers rust and clipboards break and titles fade, but truth, spoken firmly at the right moment and backed by courage and a little righteous anger, is the one thing that can turn rubble back into a home and fear back into a community.